One reason Rudder's Rangers received less widespread attention than they deserved in the decades following D-Day was Cornelius Ryan's nonfiction classic, The Longest Day. Without question, Ryan had written an enthralling page-turner, one that remains among the more riveting books about the Second World War. Unfortunately, Ryan botched the story about the 2nd Ranger Battalion at Pointe Du Hoc. Because the 6 German 155mm guns weren't found atop the point by the cliff climbers, he surmised the Rangers' acrobatic daring-do on the fabled cliffs was, for the most part, all for nothing. Ryan had called me for an interview after the war, Lamel recalled. I told him I would only give it if he interviewed us Company D guys as a group. He refused. It was a mistake on my part. He completely botched the Pointe Du Hoc story in The Longest Day. It took Ronald J. Drez, who was working on a 50th anniversary volume titled Voices of D-Day, to locate both Lem Lamel in New Jersey and Jack Kuhn in New York and get the story straight. I still can't understand how Ryan blew it so badly, Drez said. Those guns with the 14-mile firing radius were trained on Utah Beach. If Lamel and Kuhn, who had become a police chief after the war, hadn't decommissioned them, all hell would have broken out and the U.S. death toll would have been much, much higher. Drez is correct. The point Ryan missed in The Longest Day was that if the Rangers hadn't climbed the towering cliffs by rope ladder, the German guns would have been quickly rolled back into firing position, ready to destroy the Allied Armada. The Allied blood spilled at Utah Beach, nearly 200 men killed, would have been extraordinarily higher had those menacing guns not been permanently neutralized by Lamel's thermite grenades. Although it took Drez to correct the history books, Lamel, back in 1984, hoped the showcasing of the Pointe Du Hoc Ranger Monument, along with Ronald Reagan's speech, would finally eradicate Ryan's misguided proposition. Others felt the same way. Cornelius Ryan pointed out that since the guns were not there, perhaps the Ranger mission should not have taken place, James Eichner recalled, that it would have saved a lot of lives if they had not. That conclusion of his wasn't really correct. The official after-battle report for what transpired at Pointe Du Hoc was written on July 22, 1944. Much of it is laden with military codes and arcane jargon, but some of the prose is riveting. Ropes being wet, many rockets failed to carry over the cliff, the report, now archived at the U.S. Army Military History Institute at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, accurately summarized. Men went up cliff by those ropes, which had anchored, and by scrambling under heavy MG and sniper fire and a constant rain of grenades. Initial base established in cave at foot of cliff. What had transpired during the Battle of Pointe Du Hoc and during the long, grueling months after the initial Normandy invasion eventually did lead to the liberation of Europe. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations, President Truman announced in a VE Day message at 9 a.m. on May 8, 1945. The flags of freedom will fly all over Europe. Colonel Rudder declared VE Day the greatest moment of his life, besides getting married. Rudder's personal correspondence from 1944, housed at Cushing Memorial Library at Texas A&M, reveals what a truly agonizing year he had endured. Part of his responsibility as commanding officer was to write condolence letters to the families of Rangers killed in the European theater. Here's one addressed to the mother of Corporal Willis Caperton, a Ranger who was killed in France. Dear Mrs. Caperton, no commanding officer can ever find words to adequately express his deep sympathy with those whose sons, husband, or brothers finished their earthly tour of duty while under his command. The soldiers who formed the Ranger Battalion were the best, all volunteers. Their strenuous training and carefully supervised work and recreation brought officers and the men and their buddies close, so close that they learned mutual respect and a dependence upon each other to carry out the individual tasks in order that the unit plan might work. The day of invasion found these men ready, fully trained, fully equipped, not only physically but mentally. On the day before they came to France, men of all faiths gathered with the chaplain and dedicated the work at hand to God and their individual part in it as subject to His holy will. The mission of the Rangers was successfully accomplished, but as with all worthwhile things, the cost was great, so great indeed that it cost the life you cherished and lost us a comrade and a friend. A country must be great to call for the sacrifice of such men, but America will always be great just because such men have fallen in order that the principles expressed in our Constitution might endure. Every public honor will be awarded his memory. His president has already proclaimed him a hero. A grateful Congress will erect a monument to his name. The people of America will realize what that gold star means to those who loved him and will resolve to keep America worthy of such men. More than all of these, however, the surviving Rangers, his buddies, will carry with them all their lives the example of his courage and will do their best to instill a like nobility in the hearts of generations to come. So our comrade is gone, and we realize that there is a void in your heart which neither your country's gratitude nor our sympathy can fill. We, with whom we shared his life, ask only now to share his memory, that it may inspire us all to the gaining of an early victory and the making of a lasting peace. With deepest sympathy, James E. Rutter, Lieutenant Colonel Infantry, commanding. As for Colonel Rutter, who had been wounded 3 times, he returned to Texas after the war a hero, a modern-day Travis or Bowie. Proudly pinned on his chest were the Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and French Legion of Honor. While in Europe, besides missing his wife, he had daydreamed of being a rancher. Within a matter of a few years, he acquired a large cattle herd back in Texas. A Stetson hat replaced his ranger helmet. As an active member of the Democratic Party, he became politically interested in helping the hamlet of Brady prosper. For 6 years, 1946 to 1952, he served as mayor. After a brief spell as Texas Land Commissioner, he bowed out of politics to become a vice president of Texas A&M University, then president. A brouhaha ensued in 1963 when Rutter, after being president for 5 years, decided that the all-male Texas A&M should allow female students. Rutter pronounced, "Now is the time to change and move on." History proved Rutter right for pushing the Texas A&M University system into the modern world. Unfortunately, after surviving both D-Day and the female enrollment controversy, Rutter suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died on March 23, 1970. He was only 59. Anybody who knew him said it was way too young for a man of such indomitable character to die. Chapter 4. Reagan's Hollywood War. The Rutter's Rangers, who returned home in 1945, embraced the gospel of normalcy, claiming jobs at bustling factories, small farms, and family businesses. Others, like Len Lamell, who in 1951 received a law degree from Rutgers University, used the benefits of the Servicemen's Adjustment Act, the GI Bill, that FDR had signed into law the previous year, to get a quick college education. But perhaps because the Cold War came so quickly on the heels of World War II, forcing the United States to defend Berlin and intervene militarily on the Korean Peninsula, there was no time for proper remembrance of D-Day on its 10th or 20th anniversary. With the exception of Walter Cronkite's insightful 1964 interview with former President Dwight D. Eisenhower back in Normandy, which aired as a CBS special, D-Day was regarded by the general public in America as just another World War II turning point, like Midway, Guadalcanal, or the Bulge. No active president, in fact, had visited the D-Day battlefield sites while in office until Ronald Reagan paid homage in 1984. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson had thought about going to Normandy for the 20th anniversary, but due to an overbooked campaign year agenda, he didn't. Likewise, Richard Nixon almost attended the 30th anniversary ceremonies in 1974, but the all-consuming Watergate imbroglio derailed his tentative plans. Some of Rutter's Rangers did make private pilgrimages back to Pointe Du Hoc, poking around the desultory rubble like everyday tourists. Up until Reagan became president, however, few paid any serious attention to their historical raid. Although being able to boast that you had climbed the cliffs meant something at Rangers Association meetings and Veterans of Foreign Wars halls. 5 of the 2nd Battalion D-Day heroes were inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame at Fort Benning, Georgia. Walter Block, William Clark, Jack Kuhn, Leonard Lamel, and James Rudder. Rangers like First Sergeant John Elderly and Lieutenant Elmar Vermeer never dreamed any of their cohorts would be officially memorialized in any specific way. But when mentioning the carnage that occurred at Pointe Du Hoc at reunions or on the telephone, the veterans of the 2nd Ranger Battalion rightly swelled with pride. They were proud of the job they had done. Their Ranger patch was the only accolade they needed or wanted. Among themselves, they proudly spoke of liberating the hell out of the point, but sadly remembered their fallen friends. We left the area together, but the sounds and the smells of the battlefield still remain vivid in my mind, Lieutenant Vermeer recalled. Yes, you can see the battlefield and hear the battlefield, but it's the smell of death that really penetrates everything. You smell it as soon as the shells explode and the bullets fly, long before the dead bodies of your comrades start to decompose. It is a smell you'll never forget. Given the fact that Ronald Reagan conjured up many anecdotes about the Second World War with such powerful emotive clarity, as if they came from the very depths of his soul, it's somewhat surprising to remember that he himself never saw combat or smelled death. He spent 1941 to 1945 in the safe haven of California. Reagan's war stories are real to him. His war stories were his war, in part because he was acting a role as a soldier himself, off to war while at home, historian Gary Wills noted in Reagan's America. And his hometown Los Angeles was a strange mixture of real and make-believe war. The only battlefield action Reagan saw was in weekly newsreels, propaganda shorts, and training films. His notions of D-Day Rangers came from Ryan's The Longest Day, an action-packed recapitulation of June 6, 1944. Yet he never tried to pretend otherwise. He never tried to claim glory for himself. Often, however, he would invent war stories, parables really, that made the stoic valor of G.I. Joe radiate even brighter than a Stars and Stripes propaganda report. Never too concerned about factual accuracy, Reagan, for decades and in front of numerous audiences, told an apocryphal story about a B-17 pilot whose plane was crippled by enemy fire. They were spiraling downward, certain to crash. The pilot ordered his crew to bail at once before they all died. Suddenly, the pilot realized that his belly gunner was bleeding profusely, too badly wounded to jump, wailing in fright about his imminent demise. "Never mind, son," the pilot shouted out. "We'll write it down together." The problem with Reagan's B-17 story is that if the pilot and gunner died together, who lived to tell the story? The answer is Reagan, who fancied himself from around Pearl Harbor onward as the raconteur of Ambrose's weed generation. But to his credit, he was self-deprecating about his own service. The most moving World War II story in Reagan's autobiography, An American Life, in fact, comically relates how his poor eyesight kept him from going overseas. "When my turn came for a physical exam, everything was fine except my vision without glasses," Reagan wrote. "One of the doctors who was administering the test told me after checking my eyes that if they sent me overseas, I'd shoot a general. The other said, 'Yes, and you'd miss 'em.'" Instead of fighting fascism abroad, Reagan was placed on active duty in the United States on April 14, 1942. He was, as historian Edmund Morris wrote in Dutch, a celluloid commando. But his interest in all things military could be traced back to his years growing up in Illinois and Iowa. He had first enrolled in a series of home study Army extension courses as early as 1935. Dutifully, he completed 14 courses while working at various Hawkeye State radio stations, receiving certificates of completion in military discipline, courtesies and customs of the service, organization of the cavalry, military law, military sanitation and first aid, and map reading. With great excitement, he signed up with the Army Enlisted Reserve on April 29, 1937, as a private assigned to Troop B, 332nd Cavalry at Des Moines. Why the cavalry? Because Reagan had been enchanted since childhood by a passion for Zane Grey-like cowboys, fading into an orange sunset, riding their favorite horses with names like Trigger and Rifle. The very utterance of the word cavalry conjured up to Reagan's mind romantic Wild West notions of Cody and Custer on the gallop. Very soon, on May 25th, Reagan was appointed second lieutenant in the Officers' Reserve Corps of the Cavalry. A few weeks later, he accepted his officer's commission and was assigned to the 323rd Cavalry. Reagan's first assignment during World War II was at Fort Mason, located between Fisherman's Wharf and the Golden Gate Bridge on lovely San Francisco Bay. The fort was the official San Francisco port of embarkation. Based around a huge pier and dock system, Fort Mason, the New York Times Magazine noted, dealt in a single commodity: exporting war. Reagan's desk job entailed keeping records on the 1.6 million troops and 23 million tons of cargo that were being shipped out of Fort Mason for the Pacific Theater. But in truth, Reagan wasn't really a dockside body or bullet counter. He was too antsy and too famous, having made almost 30 motion pictures, to be ensconced behind a cold metal desk. From the moment he was drafted, he assumed the role of an all-American Hollywood propagandist. Everywhere he went, people wanted to snap photographs of the actor who had made such popular films as Brother Rad and Newt Rockne. Even while he performed the dreary clerical task of a liaison officer, he signed autographs for men who were about to fight the Japanese on far-flung islands in the Pacific. Luckily, San Francisco was not part of Reagan's life script for long. At movie mogul Jack Warner's urging, he applied for a transfer from the Cavalry to the Army Air Corps in mid-May 1942. On June 9th, it was approved. He was assigned first to Army Air Corps Public Relations and then, in a matter of days, to its first motion picture unit. With colorful General Henry Harley Hap Arnold, now as commanding officer, Reagan helped make Air Force training films, over 300 of them. The U.S. Army Air Corps was one in a series of many incarnations that American military aircraft units took on before the establishment of the U.S. Department of the Air Force in September 1947. During World War I, what was then called the U.S. Army Signal Corps demonstrated military power from the air for the first time, conducting strategic bombing missions behind German lines. In 1926, this aviation sector of the U.S. Army was renamed the Army Air Corps and upgraded into a branch of the Army. In June 1941, it was expanded once again into the Army Air Forces, under which two organizations operated: the Army Air Corps for Materiel and Training, and of course training films, and the Air Force Combat Command for combat operations. But training films like the ones Reagan was making were a relatively new phenomenon. Under Arnold's direction, he would instruct pilots on everything from personal hygiene to surviving as a POW and avoiding the perils of booby traps. Reagan's Army Air Corps film unit essentially took over the Hal Roach Studios in booming Culver City, just 10 miles down the road from Burbank, and his home lot, Warner Brothers. It was the ideal duty for Reagan. He could live at home in Pacific Palisades, make training films at Fort Roach, wear a starched lieutenant's uniform, and feel good that he was serving his nation in wartime. And surely, he was seldom bored. According to Reagan biographer Lou Cannon, Fort Roach was known during this period for its unmilitary wackiness. A random walk around the studio lot meant encountering a social ecology of everything from fake Japanese villages to makeshift Bavarian towns. With great fanfare, Reagan starred in 3 well-known training films during the war: Mr. Gardenia Jones in 1942, Rear Gunner in 1943, and For God and Country in 1944. Others that he made were largely for internal Army Air Corps purposes. Whether he was playing an Army chaplain, downed airplane pilot, or lonely soldier, Reagan proved to be a master propagandist, seemingly always speaking from the heart with bedrock conviction. Besides making these films, he occasionally briefed fighter pilots before they went overseas and traveled throughout America speaking at war bond rallies and patriotic parades. Reagan never won an Oscar, but everybody on Main Street sensed that the handsome Illinois native was pure red, white, and blue, a home-sired thoroughbred bursting with patriotic will. His rare gift, as political scientist Hugh Heclo explains, was an uncanny ability to offer up a sacramental vision of America. Today at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, scholars can read over Reagan's 120-plus page military record. For the most part, it is standard fare. When asked during the Great Depression if he had any health ailments, Reagan wrote on a couple of enlistment forms, "Kicked by a horse, 1937. But on November 29, 1941, just 8 days before Pearl Harbor, Reagan, then a second lieutenant in the Cavalry Reserve, listed a number of personal reasons that made active duty an impossibility. A. I have 4 dependents that are totally depending on me for a living. The pay and allowances of a second lieutenant would be insufficient to meet their needs. B. Due to the nature of my work, I do not feel that I should be ordered to extend active duty with the regular Army until war is actually declared, at which time I will be more than glad to serve my country. C. A recent report of physical examination taken at Fort MacArthur, California, shows that I am permanently incapacitated for active duty due to compound myopic astigmatism, bilateral, severe, distant vision, 6/200 both eyes without glasses. Besides training flicks and Main Street galas, the vision-deficient Reagan did perform in a major motion picture during World War II. It was composer Irving Berlin's blockbuster This Is the Army, made in Burbank. With his slick-back hair, muscular physique, and pressed military uniform, Reagan presented himself as the ideal poster man for the U.S. Army. The message was clear. Uncle Sam had recruited Reagan. Now he wanted you. While more than 300 servicemen appeared in This Is the Army, Reagan was the genuine star. Relieved not to be making training flicks, Reagan performed admirably in the musical, which showcased such durable Berlin songs as God Bless America, We're on Our Way to France, and This Is the Army, Mr. Jones. A highlight of the film was when the 55-year-old Berlin, in a cameo, sang Oh, How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning. Heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis and singer Kate Smith also made appearances. Directed by Michael Curtiz, the Warner Brothers movie raised over $2 million for Army relief. As far as most of the cast, including Reagan, were concerned, historian Janice Anderson wrote, the film was a military assignment. During the filming, Reagan was shaken by an encounter he had with Irving Berlin. Although they had met a few times before and Reagan was a Hollywood celebrity, Berlin acted like he didn't know him. At one point, after Reagan filmed a fine sequence with actors George Murphy and Alan Hale, Berlin pulled him aside for counseling. You really should give this business some consideration when the war is over, Berlin suggested to him. It's very possible you could have a career in show business. Have a career in it? Reagan had already made more than 30 movies. Always sensitive about his chosen craft and insulted by being ignored as a B actor, Reagan was wounded by Berlin's awkward attempt at a gracious remark. Had he made so little impact on the film industry that the legendary Berlin didn't know who he was? Was he just a forgettable matinee idol? Had he already become a has-been? Shouldn't he strive for something more? It seems to me that Reagan's time in uniform during World War II transformed his self-awareness. The same could be said about the other Cold War presidents who served as junior officers in World War II: Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. By December 9, 1945, when Reagan was released from active duty, he had reached the rank of captain. This high-ranking military status meant a tremendous amount to him. But he could never become a genuine decorated war hero. A history buff, he didn't want to be just a B-grade or even an A-level actor. While he admired such talented colleagues as Clark Gable, Errol Flynn, and Gary Cooper, his true hero was President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Without question, as he evolved as a public figure, Reagan identified himself with the Squire of Hyde Park. Reagan, for example, considered his poor eyesight a handicap, an unwelcome ailment that had kept him out of combat. Roosevelt, however, had it worse. He was incapacitated by polio, trapped in the confines of his wooden wheelchair. Yet Roosevelt's fireside chats and inspiring wartime speeches, laden with determined inflections, were more powerful than 20 battalions of armed soldiers blasting away at the despicable enemy. He gave confidence to the people, Reagan told Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David McCullough about his sky-high admiration for FDR. He never lost faith in this country for 1 minute. Reagan came about his adulation for FDR via his father, Jack. A shoe salesman from Whiteside County, Illinois, Jack was a die-hard New Deal Democrat. No matter what the abbreviation, CCC, WPA, etc., it was all part of Roosevelt's innovative alphabet soup, and Jack Reagan was all for it. A good father, Jack always struggled to squeak out a decent living, moving his family around Illinois from town to town like a band of gypsies. Depending on the year or season, the Reagans lived in Tampico, Dixon, Chicago, Galesburg, or Monmouth. Never a good athlete, due in part to his poor eyesight, Reagan flourished as a thespian in college at Eureka State. His proudest accomplishment, however, occurred while working as a teenage lifeguard at Lowell Park, located along the Rock River in Dixon. From 1926 to 1933, he was credited with saving 77 people from drowning. The town of Dixon, grateful for his heroics, erected a plaque in his honor. It was attached to a wooden log where each of his aquatic saves was acknowledged. Like his entire generation, young Ronnie was also enchanted by radio. Determined to become an announcer, he took to imitating Franklin Roosevelt as early as 1932. That year, he voted for FDR, and he would do so 3 more times. In 1933, when he began his radio career at WOC in Davenport, Iowa, he at times even sounded like the aristocratic Harvard-trained president. His impersonation of FDR included chewing a cigarette holder, laughing loudly, and cocking his head just like the president. The field young Reagan had chosen was the arena of the political future already in this, his first year at the microphone, Gary Wills noted in Reagan's America. Like others, many others, Reagan was soon mimicking the patrician diction that Roosevelt somehow made endearing with his penetrating tenor voice. In 1935, Reagan moved to Des Moines, becoming a sports announcer at WHO Radio. While living at his boarding house, dreaming of eventually heading down famed Route 66 to Hollywood to make it big in the movie business, he got a glimpse of his all-seasons hero in the flesh. The first president I ever saw was Franklin Delano Roosevelt from a distance of about 30 feet as he passed in a parade in Des Moines, Iowa in the 1936 campaign, he recollected in a recently published 1979 letter. He was riding in an open car, a luxury I'm afraid presidents can't afford any longer in this day and age. When Jack Reagan died in 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, Ronnie, who had recently played a Yankee in the Royal Air Force and International Squadron, was devastated. The father and son had, unfortunately, grown apart. But they shared that deep admiration for FDR. From Reagan's youthful perspective, FDR was the voice of democracy, a flamboyant wartime president, blessed with an impeccable sense of theater. Reagan reveled in the high-octane radio addresses in which a fearless Roosevelt, sounding strong-willed and firmly defiant, attacked fascism while praising the enduring virtues of democracy and freedom. There's no question about his leadership in that war as commander-in-chief, Reagan told newsman David Brinkley years later. Our war effort was just absolutely magnificent, and we succeeded literally in saving the world and probably achieved the greatest victory in the history of war, in the total surrender of the provincial enemy. Actors created throwaway personas, Reagan reasoned. FDR, by contrast, was a gallant persona for the ages. Playing George Gipp in a Hollywood film may have been a memorable role, but emulating Franklin Roosevelt in real life was an historic mission. When the president announced in his fireside chat on December 29, 1940, that the United States was the great arsenal of democracy, Reagan was swept away. The splendid phrase stayed with him always. Later, he memorized FDR's Four Freedoms speech of January 6, 1941, as if it were scripture. According to Lou Cannon, the Culver City Cavalier, who would one day enter national politics, not only admired Roosevelt, but credited him with saving American democracy. It's clear that Reagan fashioned his own demeanor after the strong, confident example of Roosevelt, Author Mary Beth Brown noted in Hand of Providence, The Strong and Quiet Faith of Ronald Reagan, and no doubt learned much from him about how a president should act when talking to a nation in difficult times. After World War II, Reagan continued promoting FDR's fierce internationalist crusade, even though his hero had died at Warm Springs, Georgia on April 12, 1945. A registered Democrat who campaigned for Harry Truman in 1948, Reagan began seeing himself not as a mere actor, but as the California Tribune of FDR-style democracy. Roosevelt had prophetically warned his country during the 1930s of the gathering clouds of German and Japanese fascism. Pearl Harbor had proven him right. Now, even though the war was over and normalcy was the buzzword of choice, Reagan continued to mount his Hollywood bully pulpit, talking about the cost of freedom and the price of liberty at county fairs, corporate events, and Sunday services. Like a one-man cheering section, he was keeping the rhetorical anti-fascist flame of FDR alive. I must say I think he was a great war leader, Reagan remarked to McCullough about Roosevelt. I think there were less of the great tragic blunders that have characterized many wars in the past than this one. I remember him when he said that he was going to ask for 50,000 planes a year, and I remember when the American press tore him to ribbons for that. They said that, this was impossible, that it couldn't happen. But when you look at what this country did starting from the low point of Pearl Harbor in 44 months, something like 350,000 planes and hundreds of thousands of tanks and/or trucks or every kind of weapon, we truly were the arsenal of democracy. A turning point in Reagan's life occurred after he gave an anti-fascist oration at the Hollywood Beverly Christian Church in the late 1940s. After Reagan's remarks, the pastor approached the handsome actor with a suggestion. Just don't deride fascists. Also add the imploding danger of global communism to your pulpit speech. Sure enough, he did just that the next time he spoke at the church. If I ever find evidence that communism represents a threat to all that we believe in and stand for, he intoned, I'll speak out just as harshly against communism as I have fascism. This was the emergence of Reagan as committed anti-communist orator. In the coming decades, he proved an able student of the Rooseveltian tradition of monumental pro-democracy eloquence. He believed President Truman, a good and wise man, wasn't able to fully articulate the looming evils of global communism with the same intensity of purpose as his predecessor. It wasn't enough to sell Congress on the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. He had to sell to the people directly, via radio and television, which was then in its infancy. Sometime in the first phase of the Cold War, shortly before the Korean War, Reagan decided he would transform himself into a modern-day Paul Revere, sounding the alarm about the threat of global communism. It must be added, however, that Reagan believed American communists should be allowed their constitutional right to speak their minds. He was not for censorship, nor did he approve of McCarthyism in any rabid way. Over the coming decades, while the Cold War was in full swing, Reagan put his acting career on the back burner, preferring to prioritize politics. His microenergies may have been consumed by his leadership role in the Screen Actors Guild, but his macro sense of destiny was pure Roosevelt. Just as FDR had spoken on radio for the American people, so would he. And the new menace, as he saw it, was the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, who had been chosen Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1939, was, in his mind, the new Hitler. Reagan believed that the world needed saving, Cannon explains. He would answer the call. After reading all the reliable books on Reagan, particularly those by Dinesh D'Souza, Peggy Noonan, Michael Deaver, Gary Wills, and Lou Cannon, I'm convinced Dutch, as he was called, never had as pronounced a political conversion from so-called FDR liberal to Goldwater conservative as some scholars would have us think. By the time Reagan switched from being a Democrat to a Republican in 1962, he had become an avatar of shrinking the federal government and believed John F. Kennedy was not hawkish enough in foreign affairs. Yet even as Reagan became a Goldwater Republican, he was always, in spirit and intellect, a Rooseveltian internationalist. Put more simply, As Reagan began his political ascendancy, he embraced FDR as commander-in-chief as his high-water benchmark. This was, however, quite distinct from Roosevelt as New Dealer, leading America out of the Great Depression like Moses. Reagan chose the wartime leader to emulate. His collected letters, published for the first time in 2003, reveal that Reagan often tried to justify decisions he made by clinging to the FDR leadership standard. Never at any time from the 1940s on did Reagan abandon Roosevelt's optimistic, unwavering approach in foreign policy to confronting global menaces. At the 1980 Republican National Convention in Detroit, when Reagan accepted his party's nomination, he quoted Roosevelt over and over again. The next day, the lead editorial of the New York Times had the headline, "Franklin Delano Reagan." While, as historian William Leuchtenberg pointed out in his In the Shadow of FDR, the Times delineated the political ramifications of Reagan's effort to kidnap Franklin Roosevelt, it failed to note how much the two men shared. Both politicians held the unflappable belief that optimism was our national oxygen. As historian Francis Fitzgerald noted in Way Out There in the Blue, Reagan, Star Wars, and the End of the Cold War, they were both yes-men who, like Willie Loman and Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, embodied a man way out there in the blue, riding on a smile and a shoe shine. Once he became president, Reagan, in what was essentially a weekly tribute to FDR, made upbeat radio broadcasts almost every Saturday. He had remained, all those decades later, an enduring fan of Roosevelt's fireside chats, even in the age of CNN and MTV. You know, Reagan reflected in 1981, it's pretty hard for most people to realize at this time the impact of those fireside chats, that they, to this day, still hold the radio record for audience. When he came on, it was the biggest radio audience ever. And whenever Reagan was in a really tough situation, he asked himself a simple question: what would FDR have done? The core of what Reagan learned from Roosevelt was that the world was divided into two camps: freedom versus totalitarianism. To Reagan's thinking, Stalin's USSR and Mao Zedong's China had become the new vortexes of evil in the post-Hiroshima world. The great lesson of World War II, Reagan believed, was that the United States had to maintain its military superiority, and it had to stockpile more high-tech weapons than the Kremlin. Unpreparedness at any level, Reagan believed, was unacceptable. As Reagan preached it, the nation's leaders in Washington, D.C. would have to keep the United States on high martial alert and enlist big business even more fully in the drive for super deterrence force. A permanent wartime economy, as had first been articulated back in 1950 by the National Security Council, had to be continued into the 21st century if America was to remain free from tyranny. By the time Reagan left the White House in January 1989, his foreign policy had been boiled down to three words: peace through strength. Playing off of this maxim as president, Reagan used the Rooseveltian phrase arsenal of democracy over a dozen times to plead for everything from the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, to aiding the Nicaraguan Contras and upgrading the U.S. Navy. Roosevelt, of course, had commissioned a bevy of fantastic speechwriters to help him get his emphatic message across during the Great Depression and World War II. Ray Moley penned FDR's memorable Forgotten Man campaign speech. Samuel I. Rosenman and Lewis Howe collaborated on his immortal 1932 nomination acceptance, the "I pledge you, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American People" speech. And Harry Hopkins and Robert Sherwood teamed up with Rosenman on the Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat. The lesson was obvious. A modern-day president, to communicate effectively, needed poetic wordsmiths. The first official presidential speechwriter in U.S. history, Judson Welliver, was even called a literary clerk. Starting in 1921, Welliver toiled under the watchful eye of President Warren G. Harding. By today's standards, his handful of speech drafts seems meager. Ever since then, however, the written statements and speeches delivered by the president, but written by somebody else, have increased in volume. Teleprompters have been employed, and at times the president, like a nightly news anchor, is merely reading his script. Who composes the president's speech, therefore, exerts an enormous amount of influence over the political process. As Republican presidential nominee, Thomas E. Dewey in 1948 famously quipped, "The man who writes the president's speeches runs the country." But Dewey exaggerated. All of the powerful speeches quoted above belonged to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His voice and attitude and determination and style, not the written words per se, are what soared into the history books. FDR may not have literally fought in World War II, but he was the statesman who personified the entire Democratic crusade against fascist evil. And when Reagan entered the White House on January 20th, 1981, as the 40th president, he assumed a similar statesman-like role. The Cold War was still raging, and Reagan was in an offensive mood. Like Roosevelt, he believed expansive liberty declarations did change the minds and hearts of people everywhere. All he needed was a speechwriter who could make his voice ring like a bell. As fortune would have it, he found that person, not a man, 3 years into his presidency. Her name was Peggy Noonan. Chapter 5. Peggy Noonan prepares for Pointe Du Hoc. Growing up in Brooklyn, New York, Peggy Noonan dreamed of a career in literature or journalism. Born into a working-class family in 1950, she spent her childhood in various New York and New Jersey communities. As Noonan noted in What I Saw at the Revolution, among her fondest memories, which would foreshadow her career trajectory, was living on top of a candy store in Rutherford, New Jersey. Eagerly, she would purchase the New York Daily News, New York Post, and Newark Star-Ledger, among other newspapers, from the old-fashioned shop. Determined to get a college degree, Noonan worked as a waitress in Rutherford and an insurance clerk in Newark to earn the tuition money. Eventually, in the fall of 1970, just months after the Kent State debacle, she enrolled in night classes at Fairleigh Dickinson University, which was only 10 blocks from her home. After 2 years, I was accepted as a full-time student, Noonan recalled. Fairleigh was another world. There were people there my age who did nothing but go to class and read, and they seemed so adult and experienced. Her great love was literature, her major, and like a budding scholar, she devoured the novels of Fitzgerald and Hemingway. She was also intoxicated by the elegant prose of such cutting-edge new journalists as Tom Wolfe and Gay Talese. Before long, she became editor of the school newspaper. Although the Vietnam War and American incursions into Cambodia were inciting students all over the country to protest, the economically strapped Noonan, while not entirely unsympathetic, just couldn't afford the luxury of dissent. It was a hot, hot time, and I'd like to tell you that I wrote angry editorials, and we took over the school, held the dean captive, and issued non-negotiable demands. But the fact is, we didn't, Noonan wrote in her memoir. It was New Jersey, and we were first in our family college students, and we were working a job and studying and partying, and only rich kids wanted to occupy a dean's office. Normal kids just wanted to not get called on the carpet there. A key catalyst for Noonan's becoming a conservative was the first time she picked up a copy of the National Review, founded in 1955. Up until that moment, she reasoned like a conservative, but often felt alone in her beliefs. Like so many future Reagan White House hands, Noonan was aghast at the vociferous anti-war demonstrations held on college campuses and in District of Columbia memorial parks, where sniggering insults were hurled at the entire World War II generation. While she worried that U.S. policymakers like Robert McNamara, the Bundy brothers, and Melvin Laird were dangerously fickle Dr. Strangeloves, and that both Johnson and Nixon had made a mess of things in Southeast Asia, she abhorred the romanization of Marxist-Leninist Maoist revolutionaries who denounced U.S. troops as baby killers. She was no budding Asian scholar, but she knew Ho Chi Minh was not George Washington. As far as I was concerned, she later wrote of the New Left, they were encouraging the real bastards of the world. Upon graduating cum laude from Fairleigh Dickinson, Noonan landed a job at the all-news CBS Boston radio affiliate, WEEI. She worked the graveyard shift. Most important for later Reagan history, she began her career writing for the Ear. Putting her pen to good use, She carefully crafted editorials and commentary for various radio anchors to read on air. She was proud that the best media writers came from radio, not television. I learned how to write for broadcast, she explains, how to be conversational and catch the listener's attention, how to try to sum up a situation with a good line. Noonan received on-the-job training in Boston, studying the literary style of such legendary CBS broadcast writers as Eric Sevareid and Winston Burdett. I listened closely to how they talked on the air, what they said and how they said it, she noted. I listened to headlines. Eventually, her talent was recognized by CBS in New York. On September 7, 1977, her 27th birthday, she joined the legendary CBS team as writer-editor, working in the shadow of such Murrow boys as Douglas Edwards and Charles Osgood. The network gave her the midnight to 8 a.m. slot. It was my job to cut sound bites and radio those 5 to 20-second bursts of an interviewed person speaking were all called actualities for the CBS World News Roundup, she wrote. I also wrote the hourly news reports that I used to listen to in Boston. In 1981, she was working for the indefatigable Dan Rather. Although Rather was deemed a liberal, one who had numerous public run-ins with Richard Nixon over the war in Southeast Asia, Noonan, the budding conservative, took a great liking to him. With his sharp Texas wit and tireless work ethic, Rather had risen to become the star newsman of CBS radio and television, the heir apparent to anchor Walter Cronkite. Dan was a great boss, Noonan noted in a 2004 Wall Street Journal article. He was appreciative of good work and sympathetic when it wasn't good. He was open to ideas. He was democratic and not hierarchical in his management style. And he tried to be fair in his dealings with people in spite of a personal emotionalism that was deep, ever-present, and not entirely predictable. Effervescent, poised, and attractive, Noonan had developed a smart, reliable writing style. Her words, regularly read by Rather on CBS radio as his daily commentary, were refreshingly crisp and politically balanced. It was a 4-minute essay that went out to all the CBS affiliates as Dan Rather reporting. She was clearly a star in the making, as well as the token conservative in a predominantly liberal newsroom. CBS, like all the networks, all media, was shaped in part by a certain political spirit, Noonan wrote. It's a CBS tradition. Murrow on McCarthy, Cronkite on Vietnam, the correspondent of the 30s and 40s warning what was happening in Germany. CBS drew people with a mission. It was Kevin Lynch, then the article's editor at the National Review, who recognized the political change and quality of Rather's radio commentary once Noonan had entered the picture. A talent scout of sorts, he sought Noonan out. She sent him some of her radio scripts, which he read with genuine awe. A telephone call was made to Bentley Elliott, a Pennsylvania native who headed President Reagan's speechwriting department. He reported directly to Special Assistant to the President Richard Darman. Desperate for new talent, Ben Elliott was interested in meeting Noonan. An appointment was set up at the old executive office building in Washington, D.C. Kevin and I were friends, Elliott recalled about the hiring of Noonan. We used to talk quite frequently about her talents. Kevin used to say that Noonan had managed to make Dan Rather sound conservative. That was quite a trick. Noonan was 33 years old when she left New York and sublet an apartment in Washington. Rather's parting words to her were, "Don't let 'em scare you." Single, with dreams of someday having a family, Noonan was never shy of hard work. But she was not a careerist in the typical sense. She kept her priorities straight. Her faith in God was the most important thing in her life. A devoted Catholic, she tried to attend church services most Sundays, received communion, and occasionally went to confession. She was not, however, anything akin to an All Saints worshiper. Work at this point in her life was her altar. Peggy's working-class Catholic background was a plus, Elliott recalled, and her CBS scripts were terrific. I knew we had the right one. Whenever Noonan wanted literary inspiration, she turned to the King James Bible and read passages from Matthew, John, and Leviticus. She embraces God fervently, Elliott said, and helped the president articulate his own deep faith. But she also read urbane New York-based magazines like Esquire and Vanity Fair. In fact, it's fair to say that Noonan, the consummate wordsmith, liked the language of the Bible as much as its timeless religiosity. One of our duties as speechwriters was to absorb everything that Reagan ever said, Eliot continued. When you did that, like Peggy did, you realized that Reagan had a fundamental faith in God. He had learned it as a boy, inherited it from his mother. Too often historians, operating with a misunderstanding or bias, have painted the hawkish Reagan as a rank militarist. They point out that he shot down Libyan jets over the Gulf of Sidra, invaded the island nation of Grenada, and taught the El Salvadorian government the dark ways of counterinsurgency. They also denounce his inflammatory evil empire language, which was aimed squarely at the Kremlin. This litany of complaints is, of course, true, but it was also accurate to note that Reagan, like Theodore Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower, worked overtime to keep America out of war. When on October 23, 1983, 241 U.S. servicemen, mainly Marines, were blown up in Beirut by a terrorist truck bomb, a poised Reagan did not seek knee-jerk military revenge. A few months later, in fact, he withdrew American troops from Lebanon. These critics also overlooked the fact that it was Reagan, not Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, or Carter, with their Soviet counterparts, who actually persuaded Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet premier, to seriously reduce nuclear weapon stockpiles at talks in Reykjavik and Geneva. Fearful of the New Testament's apocalyptic prophecy, Reagan believed his primary job as president was to avoid a cataclysmic nuclear showdown with the USSR. God, he believed, was guiding him. He saw himself as a peacemaker. Along with impassioned Rooseveltian oratory, a couple of his favorite quotes were John 14:27, "My peace I give you," and John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Clearly, Reagan's oft-noted humbleness was, in the opinion of the people who knew him best, a direct result of his absolute faith in God. He lived, as much as one can, by the principles of the Golden Rule. Reagan had a profound spiritual faith that grounded him and left him with nearly perpetual peace of mind, Mike Deaver explained. This is not to say he didn't have his moments of doubt or anger, but those times were rare. Noonan officially joined President Reagan's White House speechwriting team at the EOB in March 1984. She was thrilled to be working for her political hero. As one might expect, Noonan made immediate use of the White House library. She would plop down on a red velveteen chair in her cubbyhole of an office, turning on a reading lamp, and flip through large bound volumes of presidential speeches dating back to George Washington. She was hoping to garner ideas from the past to aid her in drafting future speeches. She admired the ringing oratory of Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, but it was Franklin D. Roosevelt who gave her a comeuppance. All those head-wagging sentences, rounded, declarative, naturally written, and naturally voiced, Noonan enthused in When I Saw It the Revolution. You could see it on the page, even if you haven't read it all your life, that the thing about Roosevelt was that he was shrewd and sunny, not hurt by man's sins, but relishing in its many varieties. She came to a realization. FDR, like Reagan, was comfortable in his own skin. A man who at the core believed life is good. As Noonan studied Roosevelt more closely, she learned that he greatly admired William Ernest Henley's poem Invictus, which concluded, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." It was clear to her well-trained ear that FDR had absorbed the poem's rhythm so fully that it had metamorphosed into his own triumphant cadence, a sound that echoed not only in his speeches, but in his recorded conversation. She recalled how Roosevelt would hold informal press conferences, a cigarette jutting out of his square jaw, twirling a globe around, and explaining to the reporters why democracy was on the march in Argentina, or Burma, or Sicily. "I'd think," Noonan wrote, "this is how Reagan should sound." Her job was to make sure he did. Noonan, however, was the new kid on the block of the White House speechwriting team. For her to get the plum assignments and not get stuck writing hallmark sentiments for First Lady Nancy Reagan, she would have to impress Dick Darman. A member of Harvard's Kennedy School faculty from 1977 to 1981, Darman had been one of 8 or 9 so-called assistants to the president when he joined the White House following Reagan's inauguration. He soon rose in both power and responsibility. He is credited with overseeing the initial Reagan economic program and its later modifications into the Tax Reform and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982 and the Social Security Compromise of 1983. Scholars pouring through the voluminous documents generated through Reagan's White House years will often see Darman's name in the top right-hand corner. He was the guardian, his cluttered desk the last stop before a policy speech, white paper, or postcard could reach the president's desk. By the spring of 1984, when Noonan arrived, Darman, whose father had fought in the Second World War, was overseeing approximately 2/3 of the White House staff. Speechwriting was just one of his myriad responsibilities. While others covertly sniped at Noonan, deeming her a CBS liberal, a Ratherite, Darman embraced her robust talent. But that didn't mean he thought she was ready to write major policy statements like State of the Union addresses. He approved her hire to do impressionistic work like funeral eulogies, anniversary remarks, and dinner toasts. Under the tutelage of Darman and Elliott, Noonan's first assignment was to write Reagan's announcement of the Teacher of the Year Award, a softball event if there ever was one. In What I Saw at the Revolution, she related how speechwriters deemed crafting words for such fey events as rose garden rubbish. Too new on the scene to complain, Noonan proceeded onward, penning Reagan's earnest remarks for that specific rose garden occasion and others to come. They were well received. Given a thumbs up from Darman, one of her next tasks was to write a speech for the president's upcoming visit to Normandy. He would be commemorating the 40th anniversary of D-Day as part of a 3-nation European tour, and she would be providing some of his words for the grand occasion. Reagan was very well read in history, particularly World War II, Elliott recalled. You could look into Reagan's eyes and see 50 years of history, even 150 years of history. Reagan's Pointe Du Hoc speech, as it was gradually conceived, was for Reagan to unite the victorious lessons of our D-Day past with the contemporary challenges of facing down the Soviet Union. Some of the old White House hands, touched with a degree of chauvinism, were piqued that Noonan had been assigned to work on such a potentially important speech. After all, she was a young woman who had never donned a military uniform, and a Washington novice to boot. Could she be entrusted with writing an important D-Day address? Did she understand the historical dimensions of what had transpired on bloody Omaha and Utah beaches? It wasn't like New Jersey, where the housewives control life, or New York, where bright men and women rub shoulders and bump against each other a little too hard as they try to get ahead, Noonan recalled of her first White House days. I had entered a place where men were completely in charge. How Noonan went about writing the June 6, 1984 Pointe Du Hoc speech can now be fully discerned by reading the files archived at the Reagan Presidential Library. As in all speech writing, the first step in Noonan's laborious process consisted of gathering usable data about D-Day. A starting point for Noonan's research was acquiring a transcript of Reagan's June 6, 1982 remarks, which had been recorded on May 31st of that year in the White House for use on French television for the commemoration of the 38th anniversary of the Norman invasion. For the most part, the address read like a respectable Encyclopedia Britannica entry. It was full of hard facts and cold statistics, but void of human drama. D-Day was a success, and the Allies had breached Hitler's seawall, Reagan had intoned. They swept into Europe, liberating towns and cities and countrysides until the Axis powers were finally crushed. We remember D-Day because the French, British, Canadians, and Americans fought shoulder to shoulder for democracy and freedom and won. Reagan did manage to cough up a positive remark about the gallant French leader Charles de Gaulle, who during World War II rose from colonel to leader of the Free French forces, but for the most part his address was pure boilerplate. No memorable headlines were made. No tearful personal stories of sacrifice were offered. No words honoring the World War II generation were espoused. Clearly, for a 34-year-old White House speechwriter brimming with talent and devoted to pithy New Yorker-style prose, such chronic dullness was unacceptable. Because the 40th anniversary of D-Day was going to be an historic occasion, Noonan cast out a wide net, searching for inspired ideas from all corners. She received input from various foreign policy fiefdoms. J.L. Shub at the State Department, for example, provided a 4-page memo laden with generic subheads like liberation, unity, and reconciliation with adversaries. It was the kind of terse, foggy-bottom prose Secretary of State George Shultz would often deliver in a bland monotone, guaranteed to put a listless glaze over even the most ardent listeners' faces. The memo was bureaucratic, lifeless in a Harvard Law School type of way. Not a glimmer of the kind of high-note rhetorical bravado FDR would have demanded from his speechwriters Robert Sherwood or Samuel I. Rosenman could be found. It read like the deadly combination of a Ford drone and made worse by a dash of Carter tedium. The State Department also contributed a country report of France, which was by its very mandate cold, factual, and uninspiring. But at least Noonan had a standing start. The well-intentioned State Department material hadn't inspired Noonan to develop a dramatic narrative. It did, however, instill in her the reality that Ronald Reagan's 10-day visit to Ireland, Great Britain, and France was much more than a drawn-out D-Day remembrance. In April, National Security Advisor Robert C. McFarland, in fact, provided the president with a lengthy memorandum so he could acquaint himself at a preliminary stage with the themes and objectives of his upcoming European trip. Reagan's first stop would be Ireland, where he would speak at University College in Galway. As it turned out, Galway was celebrating its 500th anniversary as a port city, and Reagan, whose father was a first-generation Irish-American, would be anointed as an honorary citizen. He would receive the key to the city, and, even more impressive, Tipperary would name a pub after him, and the O'Regan graves in Ballyporeen would be scrubbed clean for his arrival. Emphasize the economic and cultural ties and personal bonds between the president and other Irish Americans in Ireland, McFarland's April 16th National Security Council memo instructed. It added that Reagan also needed to express the importance of Americans to Ireland today through tourism, investment, technology flow, and job creation. Emphasize cultural ties with Irish authors, poets, and playwrights, songs and musicians, and friendships between citizens. There would be important meetings with Prime Minister Garret FitzGerald about the future of Northern Ireland and his assuming of the presidency of the European Union on July 1st. The NSC memo basically claimed that because 1984 was an election year, the Reagan's trip to the Emerald Isle was laden with symbolism. Although Reagan denied in an interview with Irish television that he was visiting his ancestral homeland for political purposes, his chief of staff, James A. Baker III, had no difficulty in acknowledging the political component, biographer Lou Cannon later recalled in a Washington Post article. Baker had said, "We have a bilateral relationship with an important ally, and there are 40 million Americans of Irish descent. Why should we apologize for this symbolism?" As the itinerary dictated, after 3 nights in Ireland, Reagan would fly to London. Much of his highly anticipated talks with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher would deal with economic questions like the U.S. budget deficit, unemployment levels at OECD, and the international debt problem. The idea was for Reagan and Thatcher to spend June 5th together, showcasing Anglo-American unity before crossing the Channel for the Normandy ceremony. On June 6th, they would visit 3 spots in France: Pointe Du Hoc, the American Cemetery, and Utah Beach. Normandy symbolizes the U.S. commitment to Europe, which led directly to the Atlantic Alliance, McFarland's NSC briefing paper instructed. The president will make 10 to 15-minute remarks at the Pointe Du Hoc ceremony to about 5,000 people, including veteran groups. This should be emotional, stirring, and personal. The themes include reconciliation of former adversaries, how post-war cooperation has kept the peace for the longest period in modern European history, alliance solidarity, and the strength of the American commitment to Europe. What the NSC report worried about the most, however, was President Reagan's not alienating West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who had been banned from the Normandy ceremonies. In order that Kohl not feel too bruised, the NSC wanted Reagan's speech to focus on reconciliation, with the announcement of a U.S.-Soviet summit on arms control to be the central message. In other words, there should be no Anglo-American gloating about defeating Germany 40 long years ago. The Holocaust, the Blitzkrieg, and Hitler were not supposed to be invoked, for fear such terms would make the speech come off as anti-German. With the Cold War dominating foreign affairs, the United States needed its NATO ally West Germany as a stalwart partner. Reagan's ripping the lid off the historical sewer of Nazism was deemed undiplomatic and strategically off-limits by both state and NSC. All the key White House people, including Treasury Secretary Donald Reagan, Deputy Chief of Staff Mike Deaver, and Vice President George Bush, were sent a copy of the memorandum. Reagan, a Marine officer in the Pacific Theater during World War II, became highly engaged in the importance of the Normandy event. As Noonan bitterly recalled, the state NSC draft that I'd been given weeks before wanted the president to go on a little tangent about arms control, and as I read it, I thought in the language of the day, oh, gag me with the spoon. This isn't a speech about arms negotiations, you jackasses. This is a speech about splendor. Given the NSC's preference for a speech about reconciliation, Noonan, who was then unaware that so many D-Day veterans would be in attendance, was somewhat hamstrung. On the one hand, she didn't want to repeat the 38th anniversary rote litany of facts, but she also didn't want to make the speech so pro-NATO, catering solely to the delicate Cold War disposition of Helmut Kohl, that it came off as flimsy Atlantic Alliance propaganda. An astute student of Reagan, she knew he was at his best when he told heartfelt stories about real Main Street people. That was his genius. Her boss was instinctive, blessed with the genuine showbiz gift for lively narrative and fabulous history. She didn't want to grind his address down to just please the men at State and NSC. As New York Times columnist Frank Rich rightfully noted, Noonan, in essence, was writing a screenplay for Reagan, not merely a speech. As Noonan read Cornelius Ryan's The Longest Day, John Keegan's 6 Armies in Normandy, and Jean Compagnon's The Normandy Landings, she realized anew just how unbelievably dramatic the D-Day invasion was. Somehow, she would have to cut through the bureaucratic thicket and find a way for Reagan, an old Culver City cavalry officer, to talk emotionally about the raw heroism of veterans with the uplifting conviction of FDR. It wasn't a difficult task. Susceptible to theatrics and imbued with a lifelong enthusiasm for symbolism, Noonan knew all the perfectly lined white crosses and stars of David at the Normandy cemetery would choke Reagan up. What she didn't know yet is that the story of the brave 2nd Ranger Battalion survivors, dozens of whom would be in attendance, would do so even more. One of the early concerns Darman had about the Noonan speech had nothing to do with her prose and everything to do with how President Reagan pronounced Pointe Du Hoc. Should RR use Pointe Du Hoc or Pointe Du Hoc? Darman wrote on White House stationery to Elliott. Should he try the French pronunciation? Deaver, worrying primarily about the morning TV audience, made the decision that Reagan's diction would be American, not French. Phonetically, he would say point, just like West Point, Du Hoc, like the bird. This way, there would be almost no possibility that Reagan would flub his strongest lines. With the possible exception of Ted Sorensen during the Kennedy administration, speechwriters traditionally are somewhat persona non grata in the very White Houses they're working in. Nixon's working relationships with Pat Buchanan and William Safire were, perhaps to a more limited degree, other exceptions to the rule. Boiled down, the inherent problem speechwriters face is one of public perception. Americans want to think that their president is always speaking directly from the heart, that the high-minded rhetoric he utters at an awards ceremony or college graduation or in the State of the Union address emanated from his own mind and pen. White House speechwriters, while absolutely necessary, are best kept out of sight and out of mind. As National Security Advisor McFarlane once put it, speechwriters aren't supposed to make policy. They are, in essence, viewed by cabinet-level officials as Oval Office mystique killers. Every time a speechwriter boasts to the press that he or she composed an important phrase or was the primary author of an intriguing paragraph, his or her stock goes slightly up while the president's is diminished. Yet, as noted, they've evolved into being essential players in modern Washington life. We speechwriters are translators, not emphasizing Spanish into English, but translating the bureaucratic into the poetic, the legalese into the elegant, the corporate into the conversational, the complex into the simple, one Reagan-Bush-era wordsmith explained. The job of the writer is to zap the jargon with which academics or bureaucrats couch their purposes. If a president were ever to deliver a televised address in the same form that some department functionary sent over to the White House, it wouldn't be a fireside chat because it would put out the fire. When Noonan arrived in March 1984, for example, most of the other White House wordsmiths, her new colleagues, had not even talked with President Reagan in over a year. Not a word. They hadn't even shaken his hand when walking down a corridor. This was unacceptable to Noonan, who was used to having daily talks with Dan Rather while at CBS. Could Noonan institute a change? The protocol was to write the speech, give it to Elliott to edit, who would then pass it along to Darman for review. If Darman gave it a thumbs up, he would place it in the president's inbox. Reagan would read the speech, make handwritten changes, and, if content, offer the comment, "Good job," or "Well done," and initial the margin, "RR." All the speechwriters routed their scripts through me first, Elliott recalled. That was the protocol. Once I approved, they would go to Richard Darman. He would circulate the speeches for critique. Eventually, the revised text would make it to the president's desk. This hierarchical White House routing system, which was quite sensible, worked well. That doesn't, however, make it any less astonishing to realize that when Elliott assigned Noonan to write what would become the Boys of Pointe Du Hoc speech, she was not dispatched to make an on-site inspection of the famed D-Day promontory. She had not, in fact, been formally introduced to Ronald Reagan himself. She had seen his feet through a door once and probably heard him read the remarks she had penned for a Rose Garden ceremony, but she had never actually met her boss. Not that she didn't lobby for the essential privilege of a proper introduction. "I can't write well without hearing the person I'm writing for talk in conversation," she protested to Elliott. "If you think he sounds stale, maybe it's because the speechwriters haven't met with him in more than a year." While Noonan, a new female speechwriter working in the back corridors of the EOB on an impressionistic Normandy address that Darman had commissioned, was an unknown to Reagan, the ubiquitous Deaver, who always had the president's ear, did the advance work for the upcoming European trip. A sure-footed showman, Deaver, whom journalist Lou Cannon deemed the maestro of the D-Day production, actually credits his special assistant, William Henkel, a former Merrill Lynch corporate executive who had previously coordinated logistical arrangements for the 1982 Economic Summit at the Palace of Versailles, with traipsing the 9-mile-long Omaha, Utah beach area and selecting the visually stunning Pointe Du Hoc as location for Reagan's morning speech. Henkel's site assessment corresponded with that of John Vincor of the New York Times, who wrote that May, "Pointe Du Hoc is a knife stood on its edge, pointed into the sea. It looks lethal, a palisade of boulder and mean rocks where Normandy's green softness has reclaimed nothing. Battlefields. You can walk them from Gettysburg to Waterloo and go back to your car thinking of lunch, but not Pointe Du Hoc. The brightest morning roughtons there, the wind working like a rasp, still scoring cruel edges on the sheer cliffs." No matter what the day or hour or tide, standing on top of the craggy 100-foot-high promontory known as Pointe Du Hoc is an awesome experience. Gazing out across the channel from his Norman watchpost on a clear day, Deaver and Henkel strained to see Great Britain on the horizon. They failed, as all visitors do. It was too far away, nearly 100 miles to be exact. Staring straight down from this vertical, fatal-looking outcrop, they did, however, ponder the slender strip of rocky, sandless beach and listen momentarily to the lulling surf. As they stood in the high-velocity wind, their suits flapping, they were both in awe. This was it, the exact spot where the U.S. Army 2nd Ranger Battalion made their fearless attack on June 6, 1944. As they wandered around, they were surprised some German concrete bunkers and blockhouses were still intact, that they had survived Allied bombing and nature's wrath. Rusted barbed wire fencing was also still evident after 40 years. They both knew from a TV perspective that this location, not Omaha Beach, would be the most dramatic backdrop for Reagan to speak. This intuitive decision was further validated by the fact that the Pointe Du Hoc Ranger Monument, a dagger-shaped granite pylon, was going to be unveiled that afternoon overlooking the English Channel. It had been erected by the French atop a German concrete bunker to honor Rudder's Rangers. While it was not a new memorial, the ceremony would mark the transfer of custodianship to the American Battle Monuments Commission for perpetual care. Deaver, seizing on the simplistic beauty of the monument, already envisioned the Pointe Du Hoc address being part of the Reagan biofilm to be shown at the August 1984 Republican National Convention in Dallas. "I knew it would be our backdrop for the year," Deaver recalled. Reagan's love of America and pride in World War II was just so real. He pined for that time, for those days that were gone. He'd say, "You know, it used to be that if our country was in trouble, if a crisis was at hand, you just pinned a little American flag on your lapel, and nobody harmed you. Nobody touched you." Besides the breathtaking vista, both Deaver and Henkel were keenly aware, as Noonan wasn't, that approximately 60 Battle of Pointe Du Hoc veterans would be in attendance to commemorate the 40th anniversary. There wound up being 62 present. "I went over to France in advance with Henkel and others to set up everything," Deaver recalled in a November 2004 interview. "I was interested in the choreography of the event, making sure we had the right visuals. Remember, we had a fleet of ships off in the distance. We used the coast as a backdrop. All the TV producers were sent stories of the boys in attendance in advance." As Reagan was saying those words, if you look at the film, the camera was going to flash on one or two of the Rangers. When Reagan acknowledged them, the camera would flash to a Ranger wiping tears away. It would be a very powerful image. Deaver, however, had one hurdle to overcome if he wanted Reagan's speech to be delivered at 1:20 p.m. at the site of the Pointe Du Hoc Ranger Monument: the French government. President François Mitterrand, the host of the D-Day ceremonies, insisted that Reagan meet for a photo op before he spoke at the point. He wanted the ceremony to take place later in the afternoon. But Deaver knew if he capitulated to Mitterrand's preferences, then his boss wouldn't be on the all-important U.S. morning TV shows. According to Cannon, Deaver put pressure on the French ambassador to the United States to not make waves and to approve the 1:20 p.m. time slot. The French moved up the ceremony, Cannon later wrote in the Washington Post, to accommodate U.S. timing. The Pentagon was also getting revved up for D-Day. On May 17th, a ceremony was held in Arlington, Virginia, honoring General Maxwell Taylor and General J. Lawton Collins for their courageous participation in D-Day. Taylor had been the commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division, which was behind German lines on D-Day, while Collins had been commander of the U.S. 7th Corps, which had successfully landed at Utah Beach. Also attending the Pentagon event was Wally Strobel, an Army paratrooper at Normandy. He was the 101st Airborne platoon leader from Kansas, who General Eisenhower was photographed instructing on the eve of D-Day. That image went all over the world. Now, 40 years later, Strobel, the owner of Central Warehouse in Saginaw, Michigan, was ever so briefly back in the news. And, most important of all, on President Reagan's suggestion, the Pentagon unveiled a special D-Day exhibit and included such artifacts as the postcard Rommel sent his wife after learning of the Normandy invasion, the flag flown by the U.S. Army Rangers after they had climbed Pointe Du Hoc, and a signed copy of Franklin D. Roosevelt's D-Day prayer.